We are here, as David indicated, to talk with each other about civil society in the Aspen tradition. We will leave time for this to be more of a conversation, about 15 minutes on the back end.
Are you I'm taking this away.
I'm double mic'd. You all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. So we will allow time at the back end for questions, but I am just delighted to share this space with an amazing panel of civil society investors, enthusiasts, observers, and we're going to hand this off to them very quickly. I wanted to begin with just a pithy definition of civil society. There are many, but if you follow the BBC, you'll know that they think civil society is a public space between the state, the market, and the ordinary household, in which people can debate and tackle action, not take action, but tackle action. Thought that was interesting. Talking about civil society and actually creating it are two different things. So let's turn to our panel, which is a fabulous collection of leaders. Dan Porterfield, our president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, our host. How's this Ideas Festival going so far for everyone? Isn't it amazing? Mark Rowan, co-founder of Apollo Global Management, an avid observer of civil society. Paula Kerger, the CEO and president of PBS. And Bret Stephens, the Pulitzer Prize-winning op-ed columnist of the New York Times. So I want to start with Dan by asking you, what is civil society to you?
Well, I like that definition that it's a space. Another way to think of it is a community. But I think one thing for sure is the Aspen Institute is dead centrally placed in civil society. We think of it also as a crossroads, bringing people together around common themes and common interests to make a difference on the great issues of our day and to build a sense of community and participation in each other's lives.
Thank you.
Great.
Mark.
I think the classic definition would be the BBC definition, but the words community and collective action are clearly part of it. And I think it's important for us, particularly in the US, to understand that we are unique. There's nothing like this that exists elsewhere in the world. We are 10% of the salary and wages are paid by civil society actors, 5% of GDP, 400 billion of charitable contributions last year, roughly GDP of Singapore or Hong Kong. And in many ways, that means it's all good. There's so much participation, there's so much overflowing energy. But like some of the medical panels I've sat through, we see early signs of decay. Very similar to our political discourse, as organizations compete for funds, we're watching them move left, move right. The loudest voice wins. We're seeing a breakdown in some of the discourse that historically has made civil society, I think, just very, very successful and able to work through different governments, different administrations, different times in the world, different community groups.
Thank you. Paula.
I always like to think about civil society in terms of community and that ability for us all to come together in engage conversation about the important issues of the time. I mean, that's what we try to do at PBS, very similar to Aspen Institute and the work here. That's why we're always so grateful to be partnered here. But I think that in addition to all the breakdowns that you were just talking about, I think that somehow we have lost the ability to come together, particularly if we're not sure that we all agree around issues. We have a hard time having conversations if we think that we're not all in the same space. We also have a hard time actually being in conversations and listening to one another and recognizing that if in an engaged conversation you change your point of view, that's not weakness, that's actually strength. That's what our country was built on. And so I think that that's an important piece. I think the other important piece is involvement engagement. And I think that as we start in public television, really with our very youngest members of society, it's important that we all understand the individual contributions that we each make and how we come together to create community and the role that each one of us plays in that.
Thank you.
Well, obviously, there's a relatively dry definition of civil society. The institutions or sets of institutions that exist in the space between the state and the individual. I like to think of civil society in a different sense, which is with focus on the word civil. And what exactly does that mean, and what the antonym of it, which is uncivil. And there's increasing evidence that we actually are living in an uncivil society. So then the question is, well, what exactly is civility, and what kind of civility does a robust democratic society require? What are the inputs that go into that? A friend of mine talks about the habits of a free mind, and I think that's a core component and something that we're missing. What are those habits? I think the central habit is the ability to understand that disagreement is necessary, that it's productive, and that at the end of the day, you have to find a balance between having a society in which those disagreements are not only permitted, but in fact flourish and produce, while maintaining a sense that at the end of the day, there has to be a community through which those disagreements work themselves out. So I think of civil society really more as a matter of manners and morals and, if you will, civilization, than simply a kind of a set of institutions that we're constructing and designing.
Thank you. So an interaction, an animated space. Let's dig into that a little bit more. And Brett, I'd like to recall a recent op-ed that you and Gail Collins co-authored called Slouching Toward Impeachment.
Well, this is a conversation. Op-ed is putting too high a gloss on this.
All right. We're in Aspen. We're going to converse. In it, you shared thoughts about, of course, impeachment, but a lot of civil society issues, including mass shootings, which are becoming all too common in this country. When you look ahead, let's say decades ahead, perhaps even, how do you think the future will look back on this time, this era in civil society, and what salient points will rise to the top?
Well, if I summed it up in a phrase, I would borrow Daniel Patrick Moynihan's great line about defining deviancy down, which is that the idea that we've become accustomed to a country in which every third month there is an act of barbarism in one of our schools, and we sort of blink at it and barely pause, is an indication that we are becoming accustomed and almost indifferent to what ought to be outrages. And this is not simply in the matter of school shootings. I mean, you can talk about as, in the comportment of our political leaders, and go down the list. There's been, we have allowed behavior that used to be considered utterly deviant to be normalized. And I'm afraid that a future generation is going to kind of look back on that and wonder how we sort of permitted ourselves, like proverbial lobsters in a pot, to accept ever greater levels of this kind of deviancy. Now, one of the things I take heart in is you can think of recent American history, or at least living history, and find all sorts of occasions or examples where we thought we had a trend line that was moving inexorably in one direction, and it turned out that the trend line just stopped. It changed. New York City in 1990 was a city that tolerated 2,600 murders in a single year. Nowadays, we're talking about 300 or 400 murders. You can go to communities across the country that people thought were lost and find incredible evidence of revitalization. So I've never wanted to think that trends are truth. I think that when we think about these are reversible phenomena, but you have to kind of apply an active moral sense when you're thinking about it.
Mm. How would you characterize mainstream media's role in this era of civility or uncivility?
Oh, that's such a small topic. My colleague Frank Bruni gave a speech in one of the University of California schools, I forgot which one, but the title of the speech is "The Media is Not Fake, but It's Flawed." And I thought that was important. It was important coming from kind of a leading voice in like mainstream media, if you will. We're flawed because the media is composed of individuals, who are screwing up all the time, 24/7. I mean,
Humans.
human beings, and doing so, by the way, in ways that other mess ups are doing so in ways that are far more visible than mistakes being made in other fields of life. So once it's in print, it's immediately visible, it's dissected, and so on. The second thing is, I think that I would make a couple points. We've become, as an institution, too obsessed with what we imagine are the demands of our consumers, the reader, rather than what we, as experienced editors and writers, think an educated citizen ought to know. So if I could make one change, I guess this is on the record and whatever. But if I could make one change to our website at the New York Times, I'd get rid of that trending list. Because what's trending is always going to be the headline people are clicking on because they want to read that hot take on Trump's latest tweet, right? But what's trending and what's important are two totally different things. And I think, just one final point. I mean, I'm a great believer in liberal democracy, but I'm also a believer in the concept of authority, that some people through experience, knowledge, whatever, earn authority, and that authority ought to have its place and respect. The authority that, whether it's a Marty Baron or a Dean Baquet, the editors of these great newspapers, that was earned over years of experience. Their judgment matters, and it helps. I think the best companies like, Apple in its day, and the best newspapers ought to be able to say to the consumer, this is what you want. You don't know you want this, but this is actually what you want. And how do we reclaim that in a world in which so many decisions are simply driven by what we perceive to be the needs or demands of the market rather than what a set of people think, this is where we ought to go.
Thank you. Paula, I want to hear your take on what Brett just shared, but also draw you out on the arts. PBS has really got a tradition of being a champion in the arts. What role do the arts play in a civil society?
So first I want to piggyback on what Brett just said because I completely agree with you. I think that somehow we've got to move past the temptation for clickbait and the things that drive what I think is just a downward spiral in terms of sharing information that people think they want. As opposed to information that really will help them make decisions about the important issues that we're all wrestling with. And I think if we can't move past that, we're going to be in very, very serious trouble. And I do think that, look, we have a news organization, the NewsHour, which has never been viewed as the sexiest news broadcast on television. But if this is a heartening statistic, their viewership is up. Their viewership is up both as a broadcast entity, but also as a streamed platform. And I think just continuing to pay attention to the important stories. We're not the place you come for breaking news, obviously, but for the important context. And I think that there needs to be more conversations like this amongst our journalism colleagues to really focus on how we can get back to a place where we are trying to create that collective common square. I also think the other issue is that so much journalism has been centralized, and I think that we're an organization. We're a national organization, but we're not a network. We're basically a co-op. Yeah. It's the best way to describe it, of individual stations that are locally owned and managed and governed. And the fact that we live in communities, I think, gives us a unique opportunity. People always ask me all the time, how do you compete now with Netflix and Amazon and all these organizations that have extraordinary amounts of money? Netflix spent more on the first season of The Crown than is my entire program budget for a single year. So competition is not exactly, but the thing is, what it has forced us to continue to think about is then what do we have that's different? We're local. And there's a Pew study out, I think yesterday, that talks about decline in local broadcast news. Well, a lot of local broadcast news isn't so local either. And so really figuring out how do we create this opportunity at the community level to really have the kind of conversations that you're talking about the big issues. Who's covering the city, City Hall? Who's covering the important issues that, citizens are wrestling with around the kitchen table? And I think that's what we've got to pay attention to. It also feeds into I'm answering questions you didn't ask me. Just give me a minute. I swear I'll get to the arts in a second.
We're going to talk about Downton Abbey.
But yeah, but it also, I think, the other piece of it is that, now I've lost my train of thought. The other piece of it is that, really being able to have a robust, local journalism presence, I see Craig sitting back there, is really hugely important. And so the investments that people are making in all kinds of new platforms is really valuable. Sorry to call you out. Is hugely important, as we look forward. I did lose my thought, but I'll go on to the arts. So I think the arts, and if any of you were in that panel that was just across the way that Jim Fallows led with Julia Schmarsh and Tara Westover, it was really extraordinary. And I think that there is an opportunity to bring people into conversations through television, through theater, through visual art, and certainly through literature, and in the case of their panel, the memoir, to really talk about how do we understand each other, and how do we create that place where we don't look at each other as the other. And Tara made a very powerful statement during that presentation about if you know one thing about someone, you cannot assume that you know them. And I think that in storytelling, and particularly in the kind of storytelling that we're engaged in around documentary and others, we have the opportunity to help us bring forward the fact that we are all individuals, that we share much more in common than we share separately, and we have got to stop that instinct of just pegging everyone as, well, if I know that they own a gun, they're bad. If I know that they voted for Trump, they're stupid. If I know that they voted for Clinton, that they're a certain kind of person. And we have to really begin to look at each other as members of a community, and how that really informs the way that we create a space that we can all live and thrive. And I think that's the role that the arts can play.
Thank you. And by the way, Anna DeVere Smith was intended to be a member of this great panel. Unfortunately suffered a leg injury and has to send her regrets. And I would have asked her about her new pipeline project, which is featuring some great civil society.
I was channeling her a little.
Thank you for doing that. Appreciate that. Mark, let's come to you. You are a great critical collaborator and partner in civil society. What motivated you about partnering with Aspen and Anti-Defamation League in this new fellowship? What excites you?
Okay.
What do you want to see maybe 10 years down the road?
So if you step away and think about the role civil society is going to play 10 years forward. Democrats, Republicans, it almost doesn't matter. You look at our budget trajectory, the federal government is going to do less. So much of the budget is going to be dedicated to things that we call mandatory. And less is going to be dedicated to many of the topics we've discussed this week. And the complexity of the role that civil society is going to need to play is going up. Technology is making it go up, increased demands is making it go up, but also the government at its current state is no longer attracting the best and the brightest. So many of the brightest lights live in civil society and actually consult to the government. That's where the repository of information is. And to pick up on something that Paula just said, the role is going to be really important. It's really big right now, particularly in the US. But we have, through media, through our educational institutions, so many places where we are just with one group of like-minded people. We have no respect for and no tools of language to communicate with people with whom we disagree. And so the conception of civil society was first with Aspen to really think about someone who has gotten leadership right, sits at the center of the whole civil society network, And then with ADL, someone who has shown an ability over a long, long history to work with many different groups. To put together a program, a fellowship, where the first filter is political diversity. And I know, I sit on the board of trustees of a big university, and we spend a lot of time talking about diversity. And then at the end, I'm always the one raising, I said, what about political diversity? And they move on to lunch. And so here, we went out of our way to go get evangelicals, Federalist Institute scholars, security scholars, conservatives on the religious point of view. Let's have a discussion of abortion from both sides. Let's have a discussion of gun rights from both sides. Let's put these people in a place where they can learn the tools in a society as divided as ours. And I don't mean divided in a bad way, just divided as real, honestly held differences of opinion. Maximalist positions rarely get adopted. And if you don't have the tools of compromise, the tools to understand what someone else is trying to achieve, it's very hard to get to compromise. And so,
Compromise is not a dirty word.
not at all. And I joke I'm an extinct political figure, a moderate.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult to find a space for moderates. And I don't think this program is going to be moderates. I think it'll be people who are passionate on all sides. But I do see, as Brett and Paula mentioned, the beginnings of a breakdown in our civil society organizations the way we're seeing in our political organizations. I'm seeing civil society organizations lead the boycott of other organizations, lead toward not only interfering with free speech, but competing speech. I see exclusion of certain groups from civil society based on a belief or a part of a belief. So I think it's a pivot point. I think civil society is going to be much more important. And 10 years, if we can put 250 or 300 leaders, and they truly are leaders, I hope that the heads of many of the large civil society organizations will have gone through this, will have the tools, will have the language, will have been exposed to another point of view. Because in many instances, this is not a place where leaders have gotten the kind of training that they would in the corporate world. And I think if we can do that, we'll look back in 10 years or 17, I guess, in the case of the Crown, and hope that we've achieved something.
Well, I think your prognostication has basis in reality. There are 4, Dan, you know this. How many current presidential candidates have been Aspen Fellows?
172. At least 5 or 6.
Right.
Yeah. I'm not
Right.
going to call them out. At least 5 or 6.
More than a few who will be in
a bunch.
tonight's debate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have so many different leadership programs. So many different types of people take part in. This is the newest, and we're super excited that it may be one of the most influential over pretty quickly because of the way it's been framed with Mark, with Nikki, with the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, and with our board. And but this idea, there's an idea here, and the idea is that building networks of values-driven leaders who are committed to making positive change is part of the work of civil society. And that's what the Aspen Institute is all about, all across our programs in all sorts of ways.
So how do you, building on that, how does the Aspen Institute add value to civil society in such a polarized time?
Yeah. By being true to our mission, first of all. We don't have to change to be an asset today. We have to be truly ourselves by convening people from all backgrounds for a conversation that leads to action, that solves the problems of the day, by being inclusive, by being respectful of others' roles, by seeking to partner with companies, communities, leaders, parts of the government, foundations, in order to move forward towards a vision, this country, a vision of a free, just, and equitable society. And as I think about it, the word civil society is so hard to define. I was just pivoting off of all your comments. What is it again? Is it a society? Is it a network? Is it a community? We're seeking the word that gets the concept. Space, it's hard to define. But the idea to me is, I want to kind of almost synthesize what you all said, that civil society is a community and a network of fellow travelers moving towards something positive that allows our individuals, our communities, our families to experience freedom, growth, and prosperity. And that moving towards needs to be ever more inclusive. It needs to be ever more creative of multiple voices and ways of communicating. And to go to Brett's point, it needs to be ever more aware that we don't need fewer arguments, we need better arguments. But I think starting with the argument part is possibly a little less promising than starting with the vision part. What's the vision we're working towards? A free, just, inclusive, equitable society. And then how do we get there? More arguments that are better, more identification of leaders who want to make a difference and support for them, and more engagement of modes of communication, modes of sharing that allow us to access understanding through different vehicles. Thank
you. I would encourage you all to be thinking about your questions because we're going to turn to you momentarily. I wanted to ask Brett to talk a little bit more about a notion in one of his recent op-eds, this concept of a prophetic culture. Prophetic, as in prophets. We've kind of blasted into the future and looking back. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was actually quoting someone who's right here, Pamela Peresky, who writes for Psychology Today and is a resident of Aspen and has been participating in the Aspen Institute for years. And she wrote what I thought was a really astute piece in Psychology Today. So I did what columnists like to do, which is steal other people's ideas. So you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But what I was contrasting prophetic culture to was apocalyptic culture. And apocalyptic culture doesn't believe that there are any solutions other than total ones. Doesn't believe in the arts of compromise. It believes in a kind of, this is how it must be. This is how we must get there as quickly as possible, and everything that stands in the way of a particular vision has to die. Now, there have been aspects of prophetic culture or apocalyptic culture that have in fact been wedded to, I think, causes most of us would think, are just. I mean, John Brown of, Harper's Ferry had a kind of an apocalyptic mindset, very different from Abraham Lincoln, who was much more prepared to work with, if you forgive the cliche, the crooked timber of human nature, and much more understanding of and empathic when it came to the motivations and thinking of the people who would become his enemies. I think there's no greater statement of prophetic culture than his first inaugural address, when he's talking about rekindling the better angels of our nature, a kind of an understanding of human nature that is inherently fallen and fallible, and yet, and this goes to what you were saying, also potentially improvable and perfectible. Mm-hmm. And I think of leaders like Lincoln or Martin Luther King as belonging to that prophetic culture, which understands you work with what you got, right? And you don't cast people, you don't simply cast people out. There's a wonderful line about politics. Cy Kanan once said it. He said, in politics, you should only have friends and potential friends.
No frenemies?
No, but it's an ingenious way of thinking about things. And I think that's exactly the right sort of thinking that we need in terms of prophetic culture. Now, today, both on the left and the right, we have apocalyptic culture. I talk to my erstwhile colleagues in the conservative world, and they looked at the 2016 election as like a moment when either we were going to, save ourselves by whatever means necessary, or la deluge. And another democratic term to them meant really like, they honestly think the destruction of human civilization as we know it. That's apocalyptic. Right. At the same time, I look at what's happening on college campuses with this whole business of cancel culture. This speaker can't speak. That professor should be defenestrated. We don't want to hear from the other guy. And that strikes me as also a piece of the apocalyptic strain in our culture. I think we really have to do a lot to rekindle that prophetic side.
Thank you.
That's really good.
We'll come back to the panel for a final word, but let's hear questions. We'll start in the back, please. Yes, gentleman right here.
Thank you guys very much for this. I mean, this is certainly a topic on everyone's mind. We started talking about the breakdown of civility, and it was how the uncivil has become commonplace and we've become desensitized. And then I heard you guys move into defining civil society as a subset of all of society. And I heard it being described as the 10% and it being described as the recipients of charitable contributions. And then it turns into leadership, how that group starts leading. And so I think that the problem that I'm having here is that, yes, we need leadership, and yes, we need to bring the various echo chambers together. At the same time, we're in a world of decentralized thinking, where we have distributed thought across the internet. How do we make that civil?
How do we make the internet civil? Thank you.
Destroy it.
There's one answer. Next question.
That was in jest.
Yeah.
Sort of.
I'm at least going to say something in response. The least
Please.
qualified is going to speak first. So I think we're going to see the first interesting measurement from a truly academic paper backed by new computing power, which will show fake news, which I'll use as a euphemism for some of what you're saying, is de minimis in terms of people's lives. And to what Brett's point, the vast majority of information that people receive is from what we would consider mainstream major news organizations. And so I think it does start there. I think, as I was thinking about Brett's remarks on the return of authority, one has to really think about, these are business models, because these are profit-seeking organizations other than the NewsHour, which I like very much, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I don't know. I think we overestimate its impact without a counter. That's what I would offer.
Something that really, really bothers me and is the shaming and stigmatizing of individuals and of groups. I just think that's really wrong. If it were an employer, it wouldn't work for an employer who did that. For a candidate, and I agreed with her on all the positions, I wouldn't vote for her if she shamed and stigmatized others. The people I want to stand with are the ones that are getting shamed and stigmatized. And that may be everybody in some sense, but I think that those that have less power, that are getting shamed and stigmatized, deserve our care. I also think that those that speak, and I'm speaking of journalists especially, I don't know what your inboxes are like, but so I have so many friends in journalism who are literally, people are trying to harass them into silence. It does happen on college campuses too. So who are the leaders who embody respectful engagement and that we can then point to as we call others to account for how they carry themselves, and especially in relation to the vulnerable?
What I'd like to propose is that we bundle some questions, so we get a few out on the table and allow our panelists to think through them. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll start the bundle perhaps with two. One is this question of authority, believing and appreciating that those who have knowledge have a responsibility to share with others in a certain way. Part of my question is, how do we temper the authority of those who have earned it, earned the right to educate, with the reality that these authorities also have blind spots, including most specifically proximal perspective of the people that they are to educate. So there's knowledge and lived experience that people that we center and have the space to earn don't have. So as they begin to educate, how do we care for accountability to their blind spots? The other quick question is also, whomever may address it, does civil society have a responsibility to bring us to compromise or to common good? And if we've got to choose between those two, which do we choose?
Thank you. Great question. Let's have two more questions, and then I'll let the panel respond. Here on the aisle.
None of us are born civil. I think we have to be taught it. I think about myself and I think civics class, arts, humanities. Certainly not, I didn't learn how to be civil by studying the STEM disciplines. How do we teach our young people?
Thank you. And let's come, yes, please.
I want
Oh,
to know.
let's let you have the mic. I think we're recording, so.
It would seem to me that in any discussion of a civil society, we should discuss the balance between entitlement, which I see as bad, and caring for people who can't care for themselves in society. And we've come a long way from my day, which was JFK's great quote. It was really Sorensen, but ask not what you can, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I think we've come so far away from that, and it's very hard. I mean, any discussion of civility has to deal with how much is just too much and how little is too little.
Thank you. So we've got a nice collage here on authority, the blind spots in earning and compromise or common good. How do we teach the next generations? The balance between entitlement and caring for others. Panel?
So I'll lead us off. The question was posed by Starsky Wilson, who is the co-chair of the Ferguson Commission. So that's some pretty amazing leadership. So I really think a call that I hear in the question is for all of us, in whatever work we do, to work to include more voices, more people on pathways to opportunity. And that active inclusion requires those of us with power to be ready to share power. I think that the question of compromise or common good is maybe situational, but I would argue for common good in general, because I think we have to weave a nation, communities within that nation that are working together towards a vision of a common good. And those of us that have more power have to be willing to share, to listen. It's one reason why the Aspen Institute is doing so much work through the Civil Society Fellowship, through David Brooks's Weave Project, to reach out all through America and identify participants in community leadership and civic action that we can bring to Aspen, we can support, elevate their voices, and see if their voices together might actually mean something new in civil society compared to the rather traditional voices of dissent that we hear at the top level in politics. But inclusion requires those of us with power to be open to changing how we think. And I think that's part of what the civil society is about, the openness to change.
If I can talk about the question of authority, which I think was such a smart question. Look, authority, we need to define what it is. I mean, authority should not be authoritarianism, right? And authority should not simply be, I say so because someone put me in charge. Authority ideally represents the accumulation of trust, right? Why do you go to this doctor? Because he has accumulated trust through encounters with multiple patients with good outcomes. Why do you read the New York Times? Because over the years, it has accumulated the trust of tens of millions of readers, and because it, not only has it accumulated trust, but it has held itself accountable for its mistakes. I don't know how. It's obviously a balancing act between accumulating trust and making sure that you're maintaining with the competing challenges of inclusion and so on. But I do know how you dissipate trust and how quickly that's dissipated. And I mean, I think of it in my own news business. I sometimes see my fellow colleagues, and sometimes I'm afraid to say I'm guilty of this, in which you issue a foolish tweet, right? And boy, how much authority do you lose and how much trust do you lose with that thoughtless, by that thoughtless moment. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of authority. It really is, it's the balance of trust.
And I think so much of what we're talking about also, I mean, I think it's wonderful that you're assembling and bringing people here, but so much of the answers are going to come within the communities themselves. Absolutely. And I think that the ability to, I think it's already been said, but I'll just emphasize it again, have many different perspectives around the table, including, by the way, the one thing that you did not mention, which is also economic. And that you really are able to and this is where I think the media can play a role. I think actually educational institutions can play a role, but you really need to ensure that people feel that they have voice at the table and that they're able to express the perspectives that frankly are going to lead to the solutions. I think we always make a mistake when we think that we've got the idea and we're just going to bring people around and have and I'm not criticizing you because I think you do something extraordinarily powerful. But I think so much of what we're talking about and what I know you're going to tap into is this excellence in these conversations, because people are hungering for these conversations. They want to throw away the goddamn phones and sit around a table with one another and look at people in the eye and have the tough conversations about, this is my experience, listen to me. And I think if we can figure out ways to convene that, so your point about what's going on in university campuses is hugely problematic, because you're shutting down conversations that need to happen, as difficult as they are. And somehow we've got to get and I can't believe this, I believe that I'm quoting someone else on television, but you got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You really have to get to that place where we can open ourselves up to very difficult conversations and recognize we may not walk away with exactly what we want, but if we can come to that common good, that's the power, and that's the power that we all have if we can be part of those kind of conversations.
So I think we know there's a hunger for this. In putting out this most recent fellowship, we all looked around and said, is anyone going to show up?
Exactly.
And our best guess, we thought maybe we would have 80 applications for 25 slots. Nikki is now sorting through over 200. And it's an incredible group. And they're desperate for the conversation that you're mentioning.
Do you want to speak to this question, Mark, about teaching civility, modeling civility? You as the chair of the Wharton School and talked about universities. Is this something that we need to be handling at school and maybe even earlier than college or grad school?
Again, outside my area of expertise, I think we can talk about what we're trying to do in the context of the fellowship and then maybe work backwards. Clearly, topic of the day is talking about immigration. And one can certainly take these fellows and go to El Paso and see the human tragedy. And that's not where we're going. We're going to Amsterdam. We're going to see five waves of immigration that have been successfully absorbed, and we're going to see more than 50% of the city is now immigrants. A third of them today are first-generation immigrants, and it's not without its problems. You have a huge part of the city that does not believe in diversity of rights. That's not the culture. You've had an assassination of the prime minister. You've had an assassination of filmmakers. And so it's not without its issues. But let's go see that first. And then let's go to El Paso. And so how does that relate to civility? I think when we're trying to understand these issues from other than emotion, and we're allowing space for the expression of multiple points of view, I think that helps.
But I think it also starts really early. The civics curriculum, which disappeared from schools, I think in some places is slowly starting to come back. I think it's really important for anyone that has influence of school systems to really focus on what does it mean to be an engaged part of community, and that starts really at the youngest. I mean, I don't want to take this conversation to a crazy place, but even in the kids programming which we do, and we focus on pre-K. We have created small little, there are commercials between our shows that talk about, what does it mean to vote? What does it mean? All those things, we all remember when this was part of the larger dialogue. And I think we have to be more mindful in making sure that your example is a powerful one, but that we're not losing any opportunity through this whole continuum to really try to look for ways that we can tee up this whole idea that each one of us has a responsibility to build the communities in which we want to live. Yeah. And let's start with our youngest members of our communities to help them understand that they have a role.
I agree with that. And with that, I think needs to be, and Aspen's doing a lot of this, practical action to help the people in communities that are less advantaged, that feel shut out, to feel that there's an opportunity structure for their children that makes buying into our culture worth it. I do think teaching civility or civics is really important. But I also think that we have to make sure we really ask ourselves, is economic growth inclusive enough today? And if it's not, what can we do reasonably and rationally to help people in rural and urban communities around the country where there aren't jobs and where people are leaving and where people feel futureless? What can we do practically on the ground so we merge together those ideals with their actual lived sense that your children can grow up with opportunity? I have a colleague, Catherine Ferguson over here, whose focus, relentless, is doing that in rural communities around the country. She's not hosting ideas festivals. She's fostering economic development in community after community as a partner to this idea of civil engagement.
Maybe we need a rural satellite ideas festival.
Yeah.
We've got time for one pithy question. Who's got that question? Right here.
I think before we start to discuss what civility is, you have to have the ability to have a discussion civilly, and if that's the right word. And I think that's what we've lost. I think you hear so many discussions where they're just yelling at each other. And if you want to teach children how to be civil, it has to start with what are the rules of conversation? And how do you enforce those rules so that you can have a civil conversation? And I've been very involved in early childhood for a number of years. And very early, children are starting to, I hate to say it, but to yell at each other and not have, the civil conversation of what the rules are.
We put out our National Commission on Social and Emotional Learning and how it relates to academic learning in the fall. It's been a 3-year project of researchers, teachers, parents, foundations, community leaders, trying to get just your point. What's the foundation of social and emotional development upon which academic development is then based? I was really proud that the Aspen Institute was the convener of this work. And I think it really gets to your point. We're now translating the report in schools to get people educators working to work with parents on exactly that point, how to care for and attend to the social and emotional development of 4 and 5-year-olds so that they can then have the capacity to start to think and learn.
I've gotten the 0 time remaining. I want to take 10 seconds, lightning round, individual or institution, who's a role model in your mind for civility? Brett, you ready?
Sure. One of the great interviews I conducted was with the late Václav Havel of then Czechoslovakia. And we spent the entire conversation, well, not the entire, but much of the conversation talking about his smoking because he lost a lung to smoking. But he insisted that he never wanted to be one of those horrible ex-smokers who become fanatics in their own right. And the conversation really was about how to hold to a conviction without becoming fanatic about it. And that left a lasting impression.
Thank you. Paula?
Mine was a philosophy teacher that I had in college. And I learned so much in that course. And I was actually in pre-med at the time and had taken the course because it was open and it fit in my schedule. And I think the ability to think and share and really process thought, it changed me, and it was hugely impactful.
For me, Shimon Peres. So no matter how many times I saw him, no matter how advanced he was and how much he had accomplished, he never looked back. He always looked forward.
Dan?
Dr. King, who worked for common good, not compromise, although he compromised, but also in my own life. My mom, we lived in an all-white working-class neighborhood in Baltimore. She was a single mom going to school at night, raising 2 kids. When the first black family moved in, about 15% of that neighborhood threw rocks at their house, rode on their car, threw tomatoes at their house, and called our family names because my mom went up and brought casseroles and said, welcome. Over 6 months, half the neighborhood left. It was white flight. I saw it as a 10-year-old. Everyone who moved in was African American. And then that neighborhood stabilized and became a beloved community. It was a great place. But my mom taught me that it was important for me, growing up, always to ask myself, honestly, what kind of a white person am I going to be?
And on that note, what is civil society? Thank you, panel.